The bank called me in the middle of my sister's wedding reception to ask one question I never saw coming. "Ma'am, are you authorizing nearly $30,000 in charges on your card right now?" I wasn't. And in that instant, I discovered something worse than credit card fraud. My own family had used my money to pay for a wedding I wasn't even invited to. What happened next exposed years of favoritism, manipulation, and the moment my family finally realized they had badly underestimated the daughter they thought would always stay silent. So if you think betrayal only comes from strangers, stay with me. Because sometimes the deepest cuts come from the people who share your last name. And if stories like this mean something to you, take a second to subscribe, like, and share. You never know who might need the reminder that kindness should never come at the cost of your self-respect. My name is Mara Whitmore, and for most of my life, I believed in one simple rule. If you show up for people, they'll show up for you. I believed that with my whole heart. I lived in Denver and worked as a senior financial analyst. My job was demanding, precise, and often stressful, but I loved it. I liked solving complicated problems. I liked building structure, creating stability, and making sure things didn't fall apart. Nothing in my life came easy. I worked for everything I had. While other people my age were chasing image, luxury, and instant gratification, I was building security. I studied late, worked weekends, passed up things I wanted, and made careful decisions with my money. I wasn't wealthy, but I was disciplined. And over time, that discipline turned me into the person everyone counted on, especially my family. If my parents needed help with a bill, they called me. If my younger sister found herself short on money again, she called me. If there was a crisis, a repair, a fee, or some last-minute emergency, somehow I was always the one expected to step in and make it better. And most of the time, I did. Not because I was weak, not because I didn't notice, but because I loved them. At least, I thought love was what was holding us together. My younger sister, Celine, had always moved through life differently. Rules seemed softer around her. Consequences never fully landed. If she made a bad decision, someone cushioned it. If she failed, someone explained it away. If she wanted something she hadn't earned, somehow it still ended up in her hands. And my parents made sure of that. My father, Gordon, and my mother, Elaine, had spent years treating Celine like the emotional center of the family. Her moods mattered most. Her wants came first. Her mistakes were temporary. Her selfishness was called sensitivity. Her irresponsibility was called stress. I noticed it years ago, of course. I wasn't blind. But I did what a lot of people do when they grow up inside a pattern like that. I minimized it. I told myself I was reading too much into things. I told myself every family had its blind spots. I told myself being the dependable daughter was better than being the difficult one. So I stayed quiet. I worked hard. I helped when I could. And I kept believing that loyalty would eventually be returned as love. Then, a few weeks before everything came apart, something changed. My family went strangely quiet. My parents, who normally called at least once or twice a week, suddenly became too busy every time I reached out. My mother would answer with a rushed voice and say she'd call me back later. She never did. My father barely texted, and Celine, who was usually active online even when she ignored real life, stopped responding almost completely. At first, I brushed it off. People get busy. Life gets messy. Things happen. But then it kept happening. Dinner plans were canceled. Messages went unanswered. Calls were cut short. Every time I tried to reconnect, I got another excuse. My mother said she was exhausted. My father said work had gotten hectic. Celine said she was dealing with a lot and would explain later. Later never came. Still, I gave them the benefit of the doubt, because that's what I always did. I had no idea that while I was making excuses for their distance, they were building a secret behind my back. One that would permanently change the way I saw every one of them. A few days later, I stopped by my parents' house to pick up a package that had been delivered there by mistake. Some of my mail still occasionally went to my old address, so it wasn't unusual. Nobody was home. I used the spare key they had given me years before, walked inside, and headed to the kitchen, where they usually left anything addressed to me. The mail was spread across the counter in a loose stack. As I sorted through it, one envelope caught my eye. It had already been opened, and a folded invoice was sticking halfway out. I wasn't trying to snoop, I really wasn't. But then I saw my sister's full name at the top of the page. And underneath it, the logo of a luxury event venue. I pulled the paper out and stared at it. The total was huge. The event date was circled, and the event was scheduled for just 4 days later. A wedding. My sister's wedding. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. I honestly thought there had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe she was helping a friend. Maybe it was a bridal event. Maybe it was some kind of error. But no. Every line on that page made one thing painfully clear. My sister was getting married in 4 days, and no one had told me. I just stood there in that kitchen, completely still, trying to understand how something that big could happen in my own family without a single person saying a word to me. At first, I wasn't angry. I was stunned, confused, completely disoriented. I went back through old conversations in my head, almost searching for proof that I had somehow missed it. Maybe someone mentioned a date and I forgot. Maybe there was a conversation I misunderstood. Maybe I had done something and nobody told me. But deep down, I already knew the truth. You do not accidentally forget to invite your own sister to your wedding. You make that choice. I called my mother from the car. She answered after a few rings, sounding caught off guard. I asked her one direct question. Is Celine getting married this weekend? There was a pause so long it told me everything before she said a single word. Then, flat and unbothered, she said, "Yes." No excitement, no apology, no attempt to soften it. Just yes. I asked why I hadn't been told. Her answer landed harder than I was ready for. She said they wanted the ceremony to stay peaceful and drama-free. Then, in the same cold tone, she added that my presence might have made the day uncomfortable. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my hand started hurting. Uncomfortable? I had never fought with Celine over her relationship. I had never created scenes at family events. I had never done anything that justified being cut out of one of the biggest days of her life. I asked if I had done something wrong. My mother avoided the question completely. She repeated that this was just what they felt was best, and then told me not to take it personally. Not take it personally? My family had planned an entire wedding in secret and deliberately left me out of it. How exactly was I supposed to take that? After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring through the windshield, trying not to fall apart. It wasn't just about missing a wedding. It was about what that wedding represented. It was proof that when something truly mattered, my family did not see me as essential. They saw me as optional, convenient, Useful when needed, invisible when not. I thought about calling Celine. I thought about demanding an explanation. But then I stopped myself. If she wanted me there, she would have invited me. I wasn't going to beg for a place in a room where I had already been intentionally erased. So I drove home, swallowed the hurt, and told myself the worst part was over. I was wrong. The wedding day came, and I treated it like any other day. I buried myself in work, stayed late at the office, and tried not to think about where my family was or what they were celebrating without me. By that evening, most of the building had emptied out. The lights were dim. The floor was quiet. I was finishing a report when my phone rang. It was my bank. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something told me not to. The woman on the line introduced herself from the fraud prevention department and asked if I was currently making a series of unusually large purchases on my credit card. I looked at my wallet sitting right next to my keyboard and said no immediately. She began listing the transactions. A luxury hotel ballroom, a high-end florist, a premium catering company, a jewelry boutique, an event vendor. One by one, the numbers kept rising. Thousands, then more thousands, then more. By the time she finished, the total was sitting just under $28,000. I went cold. I told her I had not approved any of it. She asked if my card was still physically in my possession. I opened my wallet, took it out, read her the last 4 digits, and she confirmed it matched the account being used. Within seconds, she froze the card. She explained that some of the charges had already gone through, but several others had been automatically flagged and declined because the spending pattern was so unusual. Then she apologized and told me an official fraud investigation would be opened immediately. And while she kept talking, a horrifying thought started piecing itself together in my head. The vendors she listed weren't random. They were wedding vendors. Not just wedding vendors, my sister's wedding vendors. I asked the bank representative when the charges had happened. She said within the last hour. That's when the truth hit all at once. Someone was using my credit card information to pay for Celine's wedding, in real time. The same wedding I hadn't even been invited to. I thanked the representative, ended the call, and just stared at my phone. Everything suddenly made sense. The secrecy, the distance, the weird cancellations, the coldness. This wasn't just about leaving me out. They had hidden the wedding because they were planning to make me pay for it. And now, because the card had been frozen in the middle of it, I knew exactly what was probably happening at that reception. Balances were failing. Payments were being rejected. Vendors were asking questions. And somewhere in the middle of all that panic, my family was realizing their plan was collapsing in public. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered. A man introduced himself as the manager of the reception venue. He sounded anxious, strained, like someone trying hard to stay professional in the middle of a problem. He asked if I was Mara Whitmore. I said yes. Then he told me my number was listed as the payment contact for multiple wedding charges, and asked whether I would be coming in to settle the outstanding balance. I took a slow breath and told him the truth. I said I had never authorized a single payment for that wedding, and my bank had already opened a fraud investigation. Silence. Then his tone changed completely. He apologized immediately. He said he had no idea the charges might not have been legitimate. Then he added something that made my stomach sink even further. Some of the payments had been made over the course of several weeks, not just that night. Not just one desperate moment. Several weeks. That meant this wasn't impulsive. This was a plan. A deliberate, ongoing plan. Whoever had done this had been quietly using my card information for a while, assuming I wouldn't notice until it was too late. As soon as I hung up, one memory came rushing back. A few months earlier, I had gone to dinner at my parents' house. When I got home, I realized my wallet was missing. I called my mother, and she casually told me it was still sitting on the kitchen counter. I picked it up the next day. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Everything was still inside. Nothing looked disturbed. But now? Now it felt obvious. Someone had likely copied my card information while my wallet sat there overnight. The next morning, I spoke with the bank's fraud investigator and gave them every detail I had. Dates, conversations, my visit to my parents' house, the invoice I found, the venue's call. Everything. They told me they would be reviewing payment records, signatures, contract paperwork, and surveillance footage from the vendors involved. And while that process started moving, the fallout from the wedding itself got worse. Much worse. Once vendors realized the payments were being disputed or declined, they stopped pretending everything was fine. Some refused to continue service without immediate payment. The caterer reportedly halted part of the reception. The florist demanded the remaining balance. Other vendors started asking who had authorized the charges and why the money was no longer clearing. Guests noticed. Of course they did. What should have been a polished, elegant reception turned into a slow, public unraveling. People were whispering. Family members were arguing. Staff were pulling people aside. The groom's side was confused, embarrassed, and increasingly suspicious. And my sister, the woman who had shut me out while expecting me to fund the entire event, was reportedly in tears as the evening fell apart around her. When I heard later how chaotic it had become, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't smile. I just felt empty. Because there is a very specific kind of pain that comes from realizing the people you would have protected are the same people who were willing to use you without hesitation. The next morning, I expected someone, anyone, to call with an apology. Instead, my father called screaming. The second I answered, he came at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. He said I had humiliated the family. He said I had ruined Celine's wedding. He said I had turned a private matter into a disaster. I tried to explain that the bank had contacted me and I had reported fraud because fraud is exactly what it was. He didn't care. He said if I truly loved my family, I should have stayed quiet and dealt with it later. Then my mother got on the phone. Her voice was ice cold. She said I made more money than anyone else in the family and that covering the wedding wouldn't have hurt me. I still remember the silence that followed that sentence. Because in that moment, she wasn't denying what they had done. She was defending it. She was telling me, without shame, that they believed they had the right to use my money without permission because I could afford it. So I asked the only question that mattered. Were you ever planning to tell me? She didn't answer right away. Then she said something I will never forget. We didn't think it was necessary. You always help. That was it. That was their entire logic. Not love, not trust, not respect. Expectation. They had reduced me to a resource, a paycheck, a safety net with a pulse. A few minutes later, Celine called. She was crying so hard she could barely get the words out, but somehow she still found enough clarity to blame me. She said I had destroyed the happiest day of her life. She accused me of always being jealous of her. She said I couldn't stand seeing her happy. I listened in complete disbelief. I had spent years supporting her, defending her, helping her, and excusing her behavior. I had never competed with her, never tried to outshine her, never tried to take anything from her. But in her mind, I was the villain because I had stopped the money. Not because my card had been stolen, not because I had been betrayed, because I had interrupted what she believed she was entitled to. When the calls finally ended, I sat alone in my apartment and replayed everything, every strange family moment, every time I had been overlooked, every holiday where I was expected to contribute more, every achievement of mine that got brushed aside while Celine was celebrated for less, every small thing I had talked myself out of taking seriously. And for the first time, I saw the full picture. This wasn't one bad decision. This was years of conditioning. Years of teaching me that my role in the family was to give, forgive, absorb, and stay quiet. They had secretly planned an expensive wedding, used my card information to fund it, excluded me from the guest list, and still expected me to protect them when everything fell apart. That was the moment something in me changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. I stopped feeling guilty for defending myself. I stopped seeing boundaries as betrayal. And I stopped confusing love with sacrifice. From that point on, I spoke only to the investigators and the bank. I gave them everything. Statements, timelines, work logs, calendar records, office access reports. Every detail they needed to prove where I had been when those transactions were made. The evidence aligned perfectly. I had been at work when key payments were processed. I had not signed any contracts. I had not visited the vendors. I had not approved any authorizations. A few days later, the investigator called with a major update. Multiple businesses had security footage, and that footage showed my parents. My father was seen discussing payments with staff at one vendor. My mother appeared in another recording, signing paperwork tied to the wedding contracts. They weren't even trying to hide it. Why would they? They thought I would absorb the damage quietly, just like always. The investigator said that footage mattered because it clearly established that other people had used my financial information without my consent. I thanked him, ended the call, and cried harder than I expected. Not because I was shocked anymore, but because a small, stubborn part of me had still hoped there was another explanation. There wasn't. Around the same time, the groom, Darren Cole, started learning the truth. Up until then, he had believed Celine's family was handling the wedding expenses honestly. But once vendors started confronting people over disputed charges, the story began falling apart. He asked Celine where the money had come from. He asked my parents why my name was attached to payment authorizations, and instead of telling the truth, they gave different answers to different people. They blamed the bank. They blamed processing errors. They blamed me. The contradictions only made things worse. Eventually, Darren realized the wedding he had just stepped into had been funded through deception, and that his new wife either knew more than she was admitting or had chosen not to ask questions she didn't want answered. He later began cooperating too. He didn't want his name tied to fraud. And honestly, I didn't blame him. He had been misled too. That was the ugliest part of all of it. My family's selfishness didn't just hurt me. It damaged everyone around them. As the weeks passed, the case grew far bigger than any of them had expected. This was no longer just an ugly family conflict. It became a serious legal and financial issue involving multiple vendors, disputed transactions, false authorizations, and documented misrepresentation. Businesses that had not been paid filed complaints. Contracts were reviewed. Witnesses were interviewed. Records were pulled. Each new detail reinforced the same story from a different angle. Truth has a way of doing that. When it's real, it keeps showing up. Meanwhile, I kept living my life. I went to work. I kept my head down. I ignored angry texts from distant relatives who had only heard the distorted version of events. I let the evidence speak for me. And eventually, it did. Inside my parents' house, things were falling apart. Celine and Darren were no longer enjoying newlywed bliss. They were arguing constantly over trust, money, and the lies that had poisoned the beginning of their marriage. Darren's family was humiliated. They had watched the reception unravel in front of friends and relatives, and now they wanted distance from the entire mess. They urged him to separate finances immediately. They wanted protection. And honestly, I understood why. My father began facing the possibility of criminal consequences tied to the unauthorized use of my financial information. My mother responded the only way she knew how, by trying to manage the narrative. She started calling relatives, telling them I had fabricated everything because I was bitter about not being invited. She said I was jealous, unstable, vindictive. For a short time, some people believed her. But lies don't last long against paperwork. Not when there are bank records, not when there are contracts, not when there's surveillance footage, not when multiple independent businesses are all describing the same people doing the same things. One by one, relatives started reaching out to me. Some apologized. Some admitted they had suspected for years that I was treated differently. Some confessed they had seen my parents favor Celine over me, but stayed quiet to avoid family drama. That part hurt in a different way, because it meant I hadn't imagined any of it. Other people had seen it too. They remembered birthdays where my accomplishments barely got acknowledged, while Celine received endless attention for much less. They remembered holidays where I was the one cleaning up, organizing, paying, fixing, while everyone else relaxed. They remembered how often I was praised for being so dependable, when in reality that just meant I was the easiest person to overuse. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Not pitied, seen. And once you finally see the truth clearly, you can't go back to pretending. That's when I made a decision. I could keep pouring emotional energy into people who had already shown me exactly how far they were willing to go. Or I could start building a life that actually belonged to me. So I chose myself. I poured my energy into the future instead of the damage. I focused on work. I protected my peace. I stopped rescuing people who had mistaken my kindness for unlimited access. And then I did something I had delayed for years. I bought a home. It wasn't some giant dream house with marble floors and dramatic staircases. It was smaller than that. Simpler. Warmer. Mine. The day I got the keys, I stood alone in the empty living room and just breathed. No chaos. No guilt. No one asking me to solve anything. Just silence. The good kind. The kind that feels like freedom. A few months later, I got promoted into a senior leadership role at work. My manager told me I had earned it through consistency, integrity, and grace under pressure. That mattered more than he probably realized. Because when you grow up being treated like your value is tied to what you provide, hearing that your character, not your usefulness, is what sets you apart, can heal something deep. I also started volunteering with a community financial literacy group, helping people learn how to protect themselves from fraud, identity theft, and financial abuse. At first, I thought I was just sharing practical advice. Check your statements. Use alerts. Protect your personal information. Report suspicious activity early. But over time, I realized I was doing something bigger. I was helping people understand that financial betrayal often comes wrapped in familiarity.
Sometimes it doesn't look like a stranger in a mask. Sometimes it looks like trust being used against you. At one of those volunteer events, I met Evan Sloan, an architect who had donated his time to help redesign the organization's office space. We started talking during lunch, and for once, a conversation felt easy. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened. He respected my opinions.
He didn't pry into my finances or treat my stability like an opportunity. He simply saw me as a person, not a solution, not a sponsor, not a backup plan. A person. We spent more time together over the next few weeks, and something about him felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. I didn't feel drained around him. I didn't feel responsible for keeping everything balanced. I didn't feel like I had to earn kindness by overgiving. I just felt safe. And if you've spent years in relationships built on guilt, control, or emotional debt, real respect can feel almost shocking at first. That's what he gave me. Respect, patience, consistency. Eventually, I understood something I should have learned much earlier. Healthy love does not ask you to sacrifice your peace to prove your worth. Months passed without a word from my parents or Celine, and honestly, that silence helped me heal. Then, one Saturday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there they were. My father, my mother, my sister. All standing on my porch looking like life had finally caught up with them. No one smiled. No one walked in with confidence. They looked worn down, tense, careful. My father asked if they could come inside. I didn't want a scene on my front porch, so I stepped aside and let them in. They sat in my living room and looked around at the life I had built without them. My mother spoke first. She said things had become very difficult. Legal bills were piling up, money was tight. The pressure had become more than they expected. Then my father cleared his throat and finally got to the real reason they were there. They wanted me to help. He asked if I would withdraw my statements. He asked if I would tell investigators it had all been a misunderstanding. He asked me to clean up the consequences of choices they had made knowingly. Celine started crying soon after. She said her marriage was suffering. She said the stress had changed everything. She said we were still family. I listened carefully, and I noticed something important. Not one of them had truly apologized. Not one of them said, "What we did was wrong." Not one of them said, "We betrayed you." Everything they said was about what this had cost them. So I asked one quiet question. When you planned the wedding, did any of you ever stop and think about inviting me? Silence. That silence told me more than any speech ever could. I looked at all three of them and said what I had needed to say for a very long time. I told them they had wanted my money, but not my presence. They had wanted my support, but not my dignity. They had treated me like someone who only mattered when something needed to be paid for. Then I told them something else. Forgiveness and accountability are not the same thing. Maybe one day I would forgive them for my own peace. But I would not lie for them. I would not rescue them. And I would not help them avoid consequences they had created themselves. The room went quiet. My father stood first. He looked older than I remembered. Tired, maybe. Or maybe just finally forced to face a reality he thought he could avoid forever. They walked to the door without another argument. Before they left, I told them I wished them well. And I meant it. Not because I had forgotten what they did, but because carrying bitterness is its own kind of burden, and I was done carrying anything that belonged to them. I closed the door, locked it, and stood there in the quiet of my own home, feeling lighter than I had in years. In the months that followed, The legal process finally reached its conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming. The people responsible for the unauthorized charges were held accountable. Restitution was ordered, and the financial damage tied to my name was corrected. My credit was repaired. My record was cleared. The story my family had tried to force onto me, that I was the problem, that I was selfish, that I had ruined everything, collapsed under the weight of facts. I hadn't ruined anything. I had protected myself. There's a difference. I also learned that Celine's marriage never really recovered from the way it began. Too many lies had surfaced too early. Too much trust had been broken before the foundation even had a chance to settle. And that's the thing about deception. Even when it gets dressed up in flowers, music, and expensive decor, it still breaks down from the inside. My parents had to live with the consequences too. For years, they believed my patience had no limit. They thought being the understanding daughter meant I would always absorb the blow, cover the cost, and keep the peace. They were wrong. Around that same time, I was out one evening having dinner with Evan at a quiet little restaurant, talking about future plans, laughing about something small, and feeling a kind of peace I used to think was reserved for other people. And sitting there, across from someone who genuinely respected me, I realized something that changed the way I understood revenge. Real revenge is not ruining someone else's life. It's refusing to let them ruin yours. It's rebuilding. It's healing. It's creating safety where chaos once lived. It's waking up one day and realizing the people who underestimated you no longer have the power to define you. I used to think losing my family would be the worst thing that could happen to me, but that wasn't the truth. The worst thing would have been staying trapped in the role they created for me. Useful, silent, and emotionally available on demand. What I actually lost was an illusion, and what I gained was myself. So yes, I still wish things had been different. I wish honesty had come before damage. I wish love had looked more like respect. I wish the people who raised me had understood the difference between support and exploitation. But I no longer wait for that version of the story. Because this one taught me something far more valuable. Real family is not defined by blood. It's defined by trust, by honesty, by care that does not come with a price tag. And if someone only remembers your value when they need something from you, that is not love. That is access. And access is something you are allowed to take back. I lost the family I thought I had. But in the end, I found something stronger. I found my voice. I found my boundaries. And finally, I found peace.